Stim noi, din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea...
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to a whole new series here on the Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao Institute channel, which is the examination over the course of the next few weeks of the work of Antonio Gramsci as contained within this work, which is the selections from the prison notebooks. And we're going to be starting with a discussion tonight on the very first essay in there, which is, of course, entitled on the intellectuals. And so we will work through this book week by week, chapter by chapter. So this is the first episode of that. So we're going to be concentrating on the essay, as I said, about the intellectuals. Now, what the purpose of this is to outline the key theories of Gramsci, and he's what I regard as an outstanding contribution to Marxism, and why he's an important theorist in terms of the development of Marxism across the 20th century post the Russian Revolution, and why everybody should make an effort to read and understand him. Now, before we get into it, I should also say that Gramsci, the same as every other great Marxist thinker, has been, of course, subject to multiple different interpretations, as is always going to be the case. But with Gramsci, it's particularly insidious the way that his work has been used by really the worst kind of revisionists and opportunists in a way to completely misrepresent what the man himself stood for. Now, this was easy for them to do in a way, because what happened to Gramsci was, of course, that he was imprisoned for almost a decade by the Mussolini regime, by the Italian fascist regime. He was arrested and imprisoned in 1926 following what looks like a staged event, an alleged assassination attempt against Mussolini, which looks like it was something that the Italian fascists themselves cooked up to justify the final removal of all elements of elements that remained of the Italian liberal constitution, and the institution of a more straightforward fascistic dictatorship. Gramsci was imprisoned, with the judge at his trial saying, "We must stop this brain from functioning for 10 years. Didn't work, however. But Gramsci, of course, undertook an enormous intellectual project when he was imprisoned, reading all the material he could get his hands on, writing constantly, making notes constantly. The selections from the prison notebooks, the book that I'm drawing from in terms of this series, was first published by the old Communist Party of Italy back in the 1950s. And we can go into the publication history in a future episode, because that in itself is quite interesting. But you have to be aware of, when it comes to a intellectual legacy like Gramsci's, you have to be aware of two principal things. One, that he wrote in somewhat oblique terms to avoid the eye of the prison censor. So if you know about Gramsci's work in the old Italian communist newspaper L'Ordine Nuovo back in the late 1900s, early 1920s, if you're aware of where Gramsci stood on things like the Russian Revolution, the position with regard to the Trotskyite-led opposition in the CPSU and the alliance with the peasantry, you'll know that Gramsci stood on the side of the majority of the CPSUB at that time and against the Trotskyites, and was a committed revolutionary until his dying day. His work in the prison notebooks has been misappropriated by, first of all, the revisionists, and then, of course, the Soc Dems in the 70s and 80s, and particularly the Euro communists, because of the again somewhat oblique way in which he wrote, not making an awful lot of references to other Marxists, writing in such a way as that the prison censors wouldn't see it as some revolutionary tract, but an intellectual exercise. And because of that, it was easy for the Italian revisionists to interpret the work, particularly on particularly tonight's essay that we're looking at on the intellectuals, but also the stuff on state and civil society, on the way that the party should be organized. That's the essay that we're coming to in a few weeks' time, called The Modern Prince, of course, drawing inspiration from Machiavelli. They were able to take that and present his work as being essentially revisionist or reformist. And this is true especially when we come to look at how the Euro communists in Italy, of course, Italy was unfortunately one of the founding places that gave us Euro communism and all its wretchedness. And they took Gramsci's work on intellectuals, civil society, things like that, and misinterpreted it deliberately to make it look as if what Gramsci was arguing for was the essentially a slow intellectual takeover of capitalists, of Western capitalist bourgeois democracies, and that by waging a war of ideas through academic institutions, cultural institutions, political institutions, that the communists, particularly in the Euro-communist phase, could build a coalition of support for themselves and secure a progressive government by winning what they call the battle of ideas. And so what I intend to do with this series is to point out how incorrect an interpretation of Gramsci's work that actually is, and how it actually goes against both the letter and the spirit of Gramsci's writing and what he continued to believe up to the end of his life. Now, it's no coincidence that because this is a work these are works which can be interpreted in a multiplicity of different ways due to the again the oblique nature of some of the language that he uses, that it's become a favorite of like the worst opportunists in the Western world. For instance, like Gramsci, because his legacy has been used and abused so much by reformists, is one of the Marxist thinkers whom everybody looks to claim. So if you are familiar, for instance, with the work of that wretched old fraud Dugin in Russia, him and like people like him claim to be right-wing Gramsciists, in that they are waging an intellectual battle to take over the intellectual, cultural, and political institutions of the Russian state, and will advance their particular form of Russian Christian conservatism, Eurasianism, through this intellectual battle. Again, a complete misinterpretation of what Gramsci was doing, but this is the problem when you die having been unable to issue a collection of your works, and when your works fall into the hands of revisionists, and when your works become the property, or should we say, are used as the intellectual property of the Western academic world, all kinds of intellectual hucksters get hold of it. Now, it's a testament also to the fact that Gramsci does have very penetrating insights into the nature of ideology, into the nature of the state, into the nature of what cultural and educational institutions are there to do. So what we aim to do is to bring out the revolutionary content in Gramsci's work throughout this series, and argue that he is somebody who deserves his place up there in the high pantheon, shall we say, of Marxist thinkers, who deserves his place in the Marxist-Leninist tradition, which is, I think, where he would have wanted to have been considered, rather than the revisionist rats who ended up claiming him. So, before we get started officially, let's be sure to like and share the stream if you have not done so already, and we will be getting to it. So, what I'm going to do is just going to go through some key quotes from the work, The Intellectuals, and I'm going to then, once we've finished talking about this and what I see is the main purpose of or purposes, should we say, of the essay, I'm going to pause then for questions and comments from you there in the audience. So we'll begin. So the basic message that Gramsci is putting across here, that he aims to get you to understand, is that firstly, there are multiple different levels of what an intellectual actually is. If you think of what we in the imperial core nations are taught to regard intellectuals or intellectualism as, you're generally taught to think of, weak-willed philosophers, a bunch of guys in tweed jackets drinking tea, in a university common room, you're generally taught to regard it as something which is, again, purely academic, disconnected from practical considerations. And what Gramsci aims to do, and he started doing this before he was imprisoned, he started grappling with this question in the pages of L'Ordine Nuovo back in the earlier 1920s. And he follows on from people like, of course, Engels and Marx themselves, but also August Bebel, the great German Marxist leader who died before the disgrace of World War I. So we will never know which way he would have gone on that one. But Bebel, again, drawing from Engels, made an argument in one of his works that the socialism would mean that the worker would due to vast increases in productivity, be able to do 2 to 3 hours labor in the morning, then take a break, then engage in cultural criticism in the afternoon. And this was always something that was part of Marxism, and in fact, prior to Marxism, was part of like utopian socialism of like Fourier and Saint-Simon and Robert Owen, was the idea that the worker needed to have a certain degree of cultural cultivation in order to play their role as the ruling class of society. So this is a very common element of Marxism, or at least it was for a very long time, the idea that we collapse the dividing wall between thought, pure thought on one hand, and material work on the other, meaning like those workers engaged in physical labor. And it was a demand of the trade union movement for a long time that the working class should have access to artistic and cultural ways of expressing themselves. But Gramsci takes what Engels and Bebel and others were saying, he takes it one stage further, because he takes it to the stage of arguing that the intellectuals as a group are much more, in fact, far bigger than the philosophers, the artists, and the educators, etc. Intellectual life is something which is much, much bigger, and is linked to what we've talked about before here, which is the production and reproduction of ideology, the ideology of the particular ruling class of any given period. So I'll read you this first quote here, and we'll discuss this a bit further. Quote reads as follows: "Every social group coming into existence on the original terrain of an essential function in the world of economic production creates together with itself organically one or more strata of intellectuals which give it homogeneity and an awareness of its own function, not only in the economic but also in the social and political fields. The capitalist entrepreneur creates alongside himself the industrial technician, the specialist in political economy, the organizers of a new culture, of a new legal system, etc. It should be noted that the entrepreneur himself represents a higher level of social elaboration, already characterized by a certain directive and technical capacity. He must have a certain technical capacity, not only in the limited sphere of his activity and initiative, but in other spheres as well, at least in those which are closest to economic production. He must be an organizer of the masses of men. He must be an organizer of the confidence of investors in his business, of the customers for his product, etc. So let's just break that down here. So first sentence, where he says every social group creates organically one or more strata of intellectuals which give it homogeneity and an awareness of its function, not only in the economic, but also in the social and political fields. So let's take that first to look at. So what he means here, and he goes on to elaborate this later on in the essay, is that every ruling class, in fact, every class has its intellectuals, but the ruling class, be they feudal lords or capitalists, or earlier on, be they the slave masters of antiquity. And most of Gramsci's examples, for those of you who are, of course, viewing this outside of Europe, most of his examples are going to draw from the European tradition, going all the way, and more specifically from the Italian tradition, though he does bring in like Germany, France, England, and the United States as well. But no, he wasn't writing a lot about like the Chinese tradition, Korean tradition, Japanese tradition, and wasn't writing a lot about the what Marx referred to as the Asiatic mode of production. So if you're watching this in one of those countries, see if you can apply the Gramscian analysis to the intellectual traditions of China, Japan, etc. So just to give that as a forewarning, it is very heavy on Eurocentric examples by necessity. So the ruling class, let's take this, the definition of intellectuals here, and let's just talk about it in terms of the way in which the capitalist class produces intellectuals, even though, of course, every ruling class produces intellectual layers. So the intellectuals under capitalism are not just, as the people we've said before, like the actual philosophers, educators, people in the cultural sphere. But as Gramsci points out here, it's the capitalists themselves. It's particularly in the early period when the capitalist has to be a very multi-skilled individual. He has to be able to organize production. So he has to not only build up and make profitable the commodity production, has to manage effectively his means of production, has to manage effectively the workforce. It takes a degree of skill to create a workplace that will enable you to produce commodities profitably. And again, a lot of this was based on just tyranny and the threat of starvation, but takes a certain amount of intellectual effort in order to build a workplace that can actually regularly produce commodities, that can have up-to-date means of production within it, to know and understand how much you need to produce to make a profit, how many commodities you need to produce that can be sold profitably in the end. What are the overheads in terms of your costs? How much can you get away with paying, or should we say, how little can you get away with paying the workers to, keep them reproducing themselves and be able to stand up just about for 10 or 12 hours? How much are you paying for raw materials? How much are you paying to transport those raw materials? All of this is, the process of production and distribution, which Marx analyzes in detail in all 3 volumes of Capital. So what Gramsci's pointing out here is that the capitalists themselves needs to be an intellectual. They need to have some kind of intellectual capacity in order to make a success of commodity production and to organize a workplace. Now, in the earliest days of capitalism, it was the one or a handful of people who were doing this organizing. So you have to organize production and you have to organize the relations of production, i.e., how do you get the profit out of your workers? But also then, as capitalism evolves, and Gramsci gives a hint of this when he talks about the confidence of the investors in the business, the function of the capitalists becomes split between different layers of intellectuals. So rapidly, when workshops expand and production becomes more complicated, it's not just a case of the capitalist with his watch on a chain to his waistcoat, carefully timing himself the motions of the laborers and how the machines are run. Various different specialisms emerge within bourgeois relations of production that deal specifically with these functions. So how do you manage your workforce? Slowly, over the course of the 19th century and into the 20th century, a specialist group emerges, a specialist office-bound group that dealt specifically with how to manage your workforce. That became known as personnel. That later became known as human resources. Now, on the one level, that's just a drain of resources because it's not directly related to production. But on the other hand, if you work out how to manage your workforce effectively as a capitalist, you can get a lot more out of them. So it is actually a profitable thing to invest in. So the intellectual function of worker management or personnel management becomes a standalone part of capitalist intellectual activity. And also you then have specialist functions dealing with how do you run your machines, when do you need to repair your machines, etc., etc. So all these different intellectual functions branch off from the capitalist and become intellectual enterprises of their own, or sections of a workplace. Whole areas of academia then get turned over to personnel management to engineering, not just engineering in terms of creating new means of production and managing and repairing the means of production, but also as to how to effectively deploy them, how to deploy them in a workplace to make the most possible money, make the most profit. So all of these are intellectual functions which the capitalist, the original capitalists, like when they were small capitalists, had to deal with themselves. And as the enterprise grows, they become intellectual functions of their own, and they produce, in turn, growing out of the soil of capitalist relations of production, they produce certain ideologies, certain bits of capitalist ideology. Like human resource management, having worked in this area at certain points, produces, elements of capitalist ideology. And it is studied at universities. The capitalists put a lot into human resource management, as they call it now, which is the management of workers in order that you can get the most out of them and manipulate them and lie to them, etc. So these are examples of intellectual functions which grow out of the capitalist system, which become also creators and recreators of bourgeois ideology. But more than that, you then get the need to for the capitalists as a whole to become masters of the confidence trick, shall we say. So much of certainly late period imperialism is based on basically companies that would go bankrupt, reassuring the holders of the debt and the investors that don't worry, a return is just around the corner. That in itself is, a form of intellectual activity, which again the capitalist originally needs to do himself. But as the process of production gets bigger and bigger and more complicated, that in itself becomes sort of devolved to be done by very specialist personnel. Now, we've talked before about how the process of innovation under capitalism tends to sort of create silo working, and tends to de-skill people and create and push them into one particular field of repetitive activity. That's born with the division of labor as described by Adam Smith. So is true with the intellectual activity of the capitalist class. Whereas, as I said, originally it would have been one capitalist doing all of these things. Now as the things get more and more complex, you have very, very narrow specific specialisms developing amongst capitalist management structures, including how to deal with investors, how to run specific projects, how to manage certain aspects of the business, all become different areas of intellectual activity. Whereas previously, again, it would have all been done by one stereotypically evil capitalist. Now this is all broken down into different areas of business. So but what all of this does, of course, is it shows us that the capitalists themselves have, within their class, the certain people who are dedicated to different intellectual activities, which are initially based around the idea of making production as efficient as possible, and this then becomes almost these become industries in themselves, which then become like big areas of employment themselves. And as things get more complicated, more and more functions emerge which need to be staffed. But also then within that intellectual world, you then have also the problem faces the capitalist that they need to get these intellectual functions done as cheaply as possible, which is why things like machine learning, I won't call it AI, let's just say machine learning, becomes such a big thing, because these functions, these intellectual functions, which the capitalist has to fund out of the proceeds he brings in from selling commodities or selling something. So let's just say use commodities as the example. Well, that's a drain on profits, potentially, because you have to deploy more and more money to these intellectual functions. So if you can get, say, your human resource policies to be written by a much smaller, more lowly paid group of workers. So, for instance, if you, by the time I left professional trade unionism, we'd already got to the stage where they were employing fewer and fewer people in HR departments, and everything was going on to an intranet. And if you wanted a policy, you just had to refer yourself to the intranet page. And the human resource teams were becoming smaller groups of lower paid workers whose job it was just to upload stuff to a company intranet. Now, with machine learning, what you get is somebody will sit down and say, right, get me a policy on sickness management, and the low paid data entry person will type into, I don't know, ChatGPT or DeepSeek or something else, write me a comprehensive policy on sickness absence management that fits in with employment law in England, for instance. And the machine generates a policy which the person then adapts for usage in their particular workplace. So you see that even the intellectual functions of the capitalist first grow into almost cottage industries of their own, but then they, like the work of the factory line work, the production line workers themselves, they also get de-skilled and their wages pushed down as innovation is driven forward by the need of the capitalist to cut costs. Interesting the way this always plays out. So Gramsci talks about how the entrepreneurs, at the highest level, need to be organizers of society in general, including, he says, all its complex organism of services right up to the state organism, because of the need to create the conditions most favorable to the expansion of their own class, or at the least they must possess the capacity to choose the deputies, specialized employees, to whom to entrust this activity of organizing the general system of relationships external to the business itself. It can be observed that the organic intellectuals, which every new class creates alongside itself and elaborates in the course of its development, are for the most part specializations of partial aspects of the primitive activity of the new social type, which the new class has brought into prominence. So what he's talking about there is like the capitalist class then need to have specialists, not only to manage things within their business, but then also to manage society. So we're expanding again the definition of intellectual activity from the point of view of the capitalist class, from just the capitalists themselves managing the business, to specialisms in managing production and managing a workforce, to managing the relations with the banks and the investors, to then needing groups of intellectuals to manage the newly redeveloped state machine. You need specialists in how to manage its economic policy, how to manage its central bank policy, how to conduct fiscal and monetary policy, how to organize repression, because that is a specific type of intellectual activity. You can just say, oh, fuck it, let's send the horses in and saber everybody to death, as they did back in the early 19th century. But as capitalist society becomes more and more complicated, in fact, even before that, even with feudal society, as Machiavelli himself observes, and we'll come to Gramsci's relationship with Machiavelli later, you can't just keep hitting everybody over the head or gunning them down, although that does happen quite a lot. But what the capitalists and before then the feudal lords realized was you couldn't just use naked brute repression all the time. It actually, to make it effective, you have to almost be sparing in how you deploy it. And you need a greater and more, shall we say, intelligent approach to repression, meaning that you need specialists in spying. You need specialists in how to disrupt movements of the subordinated classes against you, movements of peasants or movements of workers. You need to stop the working class unifying itself. You need to throw in as many distractions as possible. You need to make sure that the intelligence services are equipped to thwart potential movements towards working class unity. All of this is intellectual work, and it takes degrees of specialism to be able to do. So from the basic requirement of the capitalist class, which is having the ability to use brute force to repress a rising of workers, you then need a much more complicated machinery, because you're dealing with, you as the capitalist are a tiny minority, and you need to make sure that the subordinated classes, workers, peasants, ruined petty bourgeoisie, lumpens, that these groups do not unify against you. And so you need to secure your dominance. You need to make sure that there is a comprehensive system of repression, which, again, when it comes down to it, does rely on the policeman's baton, the cavalry officer's saber in the old days, and the rifle bullet or the machine gun drone these days. But all of those things lose their effectiveness in the end. And if you deploy them too much, then you run the risk of unifying the subordinated classes against you, because you've killed too many and you've removed the legitimacy from yourself in the eyes of the masses. So you need to have people in the repressive apparatus who understand the need for a multiplicity of approaches. And now you see how you end up with vast intelligence agencies, with whole intellectual industries in the biggest imperialist states dedicated to studying and working up policies as to how to keep the working class divided, as to how to appropriately deploy intelligence agencies and deploy repressive measures, when to arrest people and when not to. All of that creates, again, like its own field of activity, which, again, like sometimes you see capitalists complaining that, we're spending too much on the military, we're spending too much on intelligence services, but they need all of these things. It is the eternal dilemma of the capitalists, especially the more stupid ones, is that they would love to think that they could do without the capitalist state, but they can't. They need not only its repressive apparatus, but they need, due to the nature of capitalism, they need the legitimizing factor. And here's another area of intellectual activity, which Gramsci talks about, which is the political party. The political party, the way in which it is represented within the state institutions, meaning the parliament, etc., a president, a prime minister, and the way this plays its role in legitimating the rule of the ruling class. And again, like the institution of parliament creates within it, again, bits of bourgeois ideology all of itself. So, for instance, let's draw upon an example for this. Have you ever had an argument with a really frustrating social democrat? And if you're watching this channel, you probably have. Have you ever had somebody say to you, as we would have done here in old perfidious Albion, that, well, we're a parliamentary democracy and we always have been? I'm sure you've all heard that. The idea that the old piece of British ruling class propaganda that Britain is just a forever evolving democracy. And it always will be, and nothing will ever change. Well, to produce that automated response in people, to get people just to knee-jerk say, there can be no revolution in this country. It is the way it is because it's always been the way it is. And if it wasn't the way it is now, it wouldn't be the way it is, etc., etc. To get people to respond with that sort of conservative, small c conservative rejection of the mere possibility of revolutionary change depends upon, first of all, cultivating a profound ignorance of your own history, which, again, that's a deliberate thing that's done, but also cultivating a sense that nothing can or will ever change, which is something that the British bourgeoisie have been working very hard to establish on an intellectual level ever since they rose to prominence. Ever since they came to be the dominant class, the ruling class, they've been working very feverishly on with their intellectuals being deployed to this problem of, well, how do we disguise our revolutionary origins, and how do we justify our position as the ruling class and make it look as if we have a degree of permanence here, like that we've always been here and always will, etc. Well, the way, and Gramsci comes to this, that it was done in England, was that after the Civil War and after the Stuart Restoration and after the long period of war against the Jacobite attempts to restore the Stuart dynasty, well, the British ruling class, or I was more accurately the English ruling class, because they always have the dominant role, merge themselves with the aristocracy. Now, the aristocracy had been politically going bankrupt for a long time due to the fact they were economically going bankrupt. More efficient ways of managing the land were emerging. The aristocracy, the landowning aristocracy, were frequently finding themselves in large amounts of debt to the bankers in the City of London. So this is, of course, what ultimately triggered the Civil War. But there was a reconciliation and a coming together of these two elements. So it's not always harmonious, but you get the capitalists, which are the industrialists, the merchants, and the bankers coming together with a sort of broad agreement with the landowners in England to form a more unified group, so that in the later 17th, 18th, and into the 19th century, you get that the landowners still exercise a considerable degree of political power, even if all the dynamism in England and increasingly Scotland as well comes from the development of industry. But you look at like the offices held in the English government, a lot of the early leaders of those governments were minor or sometimes major landowners. It's very common until the late 19th century to have a prime minister of Britain, or let's give it its proper name, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. It was very common to have a prime minister who was a landowner from the House of Lords, a lord, an earl, I think sometimes a duke, the Duke of Wellington, an Irish landowner, was of course prime minister of the United Kingdom for a while. And the point about this is, and Gramsci talks about this, is it's the bringing together of the different elements of the formerly contending classes. The capitalists have won, but they need to establish a degree of legitimacy. So they merge with the aristocracy, and then, of course, claim the legitimacy of the crown and the church, which, via a very tortured historical analysis which they carry out, or historical justifications, goes all the way back to the founding of the Kingdom of England in 1066, which of course was founded upon a violent invasion by several groups, including the Normans, all of whom had been promised the throne by the rather confused ultra-religious King Edward the Confessor. But that's a story for another day. The point about it is, what emerges in terms of the state intellectuals in the United Kingdom, as it's given its proper name, is they are a group which is a merger of the up and coming capitalists and the former ruling class, the landowners, and they merge together in order to create a more stable structure to carry out the work of legitimization of their rule. And this is personified intellectually, I would argue, by someone like Edmund Burke, who is a great propagandist and again, like many of the greatest propagandists for the British Empire, he was actually Irish. Burke argued in Reflections on the Revolution in France about how the revolution in France was a horror, a violent upsurge. It was against nature, etc., etc. Look at how well we've done in merry old England. We've avoided all this violent stuff. Now, of course, Burke was sort of putting forward the point of view of the British ruling class about their uninterrupted, slow, peaceful development. Of course, he ignores the century of war that had taken place, that had only concluded really in the 1740s. So that's 44 years before the French Revolution. But people have short memories. So the story the British ruling class told about itself through its intellectuals on the political and the cultural level was of slow and uninterrupted progress towards a greater degree of democracy. And compared to those nasty, violent Frenchmen, England would never do such things. And that's why Thomas Paine is very entertaining to read when he's replying to Burke, as is Mary Wollstonecraft, because he calls about Burke for being a bullshit artist, which he was. But this is the point, to go back to Gramsci, that he's making about every area of activity that the bourgeois require becomes a sort of separate repository and a creator and recreator of bourgeois ideology. So you have the bourgeois ideology in the factory and in the workplace, where the worker is trained to accept his or her place on the factory line or on the shop floor or at the desk, and that is the natural place for them to be. They are trained to accept bourgeois organization of the workplace. You're trained to view the workplace as something which is always hierarchical, which always has the managers, the middle managers, the lower managers, the workers, and you're trained to view this as permanent. It was, it is, and always shall be, and that bourgeois relations of production are as natural as breathing for you. That's how you're trained. That's the intellectual activity the bourgeois engages in to convince you that not only is this the best way to organize a workplace, it is the only way to organize a workplace. Same is true for their other areas of intellectual activity as well. Not only is it absolutely natural that there is a tiny number of capitalists ruling you, but in actual fact, one of the great tricks that they've managed to try and pull off is to almost make it look as if the capitalists don't even exist or don't exist as a class. It's very rare if you read like the regular bourgeois media. Not that I would recommend doing that, but I have to. It's rare that they'll say the term capitalist or capitalism. You'll get it occasionally in like an Economist article or a Wall Street Journal article or a Financial Times article, where some libertarian foaming at the mouth will start screaming about why is nobody making the case for capitalism anymore. But most of the time they just use language which strives to appear neutral. So when talking about capitalism, they'll just say the economy. You'll all have seen that. But think about it for a moment. What are they trying to do by just referring to the capitalist system as the economy? Linguistically, what are they trying to do? They're trying to, again, give an air of permanence, give you an air of it's not capitalism, it's just the economy. It's just how it is, how it has been, how it is, and how it always will be. You see? These sound like the linguistic tricks, but it's a linguistic and it's an ideological trick. You want to give, you as the ruling class, need to give the working class the idea that this is, again, this is just the natural order of things. This is how it is. It's just the economy. It's not capitalism. And don't talk about capitalists. It's just the economy. What do we need to do to secure economic growth, for instance? This is a question which another layer of intellectuals that work for the ruling class will give to you. So the journalists, who will then call upon the service of the economists, another intellectual group, to deliver a verdict to you, the news consumer, as to what needs to be done for the economy. You see the trick being played upon you. The economist will then answer that it'll be good for the economy to have lower taxes and fewer regulations or something. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe it's a Keynesian who will say, well, in actual fact, it would be good for the economy to have higher taxes and higher wages for workers, leading to a multiplier effect inside the economy, etc. And then there'll be a debate maybe between a Keynesian and a Milton Friedmanite, which will be about as enlightening as sticking your head in a fucking dishwasher. The point about it is, it's like the question is always posed in such a way as to make is to foreclose any possibility of more radical or revolutionary change, and keep in your own mind the question being, well, do I support more regulations or less regulations? Do I support higher taxes or lower taxes? And they keep you within this narrow intellectual sphere, so to speak, and make sure that ideally you don't go beyond that. And that's the same, as I've been saying, it's the same for every single sphere of activity. This is what Gramsci is trying to get across to us. And the division between the great bulk of the working class and the intellectuals, that is something which is conjured, again, quite deliberately by the ruling class to foreclose upon the possibility of the worker ever overcoming these divisions and overcoming the idea that there has to be a capitalist class. You're encouraged to limit yourself intellectually constantly. And there's various different ways in which that happens. So Gramsci then says the following, and I will just read you another quote here. Quote reads as follows: when one distinguishes between intellectuals and non-intellectuals, one is referring in reality only to the immediate social function of the professional category of the intellectuals. That is, one has in mind the direction in which their specific professional activity is weighted, whether towards intellectual elaboration or towards muscular nervous effort. That means that although one can speak of intellectuals, one cannot speak of non-intellectuals, because non-intellectuals do not exist. But even the relationship between efforts of intellectual cerebral elaboration and muscular nervous effort is not always the same. So there are varying degrees of specific intellectual activity. There is no human activity from which every form of intellectual participation can be excluded. Homo faber cannot be separated from Homo sapiens. So again, we go back to the point that we made at the very beginning of this, which is that there's no such thing as a non-intellectual. There's no such thing as a person who is not doing intellectual work. Everybody is engaged in some kind of intellectual work. It's just that you're trained to not regard it as such. So if you go to work and if you're, I don't know, you're like a forklift driver or something, you're engaged in some kind of intellectual effort just to be able to do your job. If you're a van driver, same thing. If you're maybe an accountant, for instance, there's some definite intellectual work there. If you're a medical professional, doctor, nurse, or one of the other medical professions, there's a lot of intellectual work there, even just down to the level of like how you organize your shifts. And everybody, every worker is doing some kind of intellectual activity. Now, for most workers, and again, Gramsci has been had been working on this point from before he was in prison. For most workers, they don't regard like what they do as an intellectual activity, or they're taught not to regard it as such. But the point about this is, and the point that Gramsci as a Marxist understood and was trying to get across in this, like, because there's no such thing as a non-intellectual, the idea that the working class cannot become the ruling class because of, there needs to be a hierarchy, there needs to be, men with, a lot of very fancy sounding degrees running everything, that the ordinary person cannot possibly grasp the level of complexity that is needed to be grasped if you are to organize society to function. The idea that the worker cannot grasp that or cannot understand that is not true. The worker is already engaged in a lot of intellectual activity just to get themselves to the point where they can do their job. And there is a much greater capacity for understanding within most workers than ever gets tapped into. There is a great gap in what human beings are truly capable of doing and what we're asked to do under capitalism. Most of that is, of course, a product of the division of labor. It's a product of the fact that you are pushed into one area of activity for your entire working life, etc. But there is a great untapped potential in most of the working class that capitalism can never bring out. You ever been to one of those god-awful seminars by some human resource clown saying that we want to help you reach your full potential? Are you being all you can be? Because if you're not being all you can be, come to this workshop and find out how. Or some, con man telling you that, sad, desperate, alone, sweating. Well, maybe you've not reached your potential. Pay $100 an hour and come to my seminar, and I will tell you how you can. Now, I'm being slightly facetious there, but the point about why, again, we enter into the territory of alienation here. The point about why we face, particularly in like imperialist countries, a situation where you have so many mental health problems, so many people with mental health problems. Part of it is, of course, the good old traditional alienation, and part of it is I would argue, subconscious awareness of the fact that you are not working at full capacity. Not only are you not working for yourself, so you're being alienated from the products of your labor, but also you're not meeting your full intellectual capacities. The full capability of you as an intelligent and thinking human being is not being used by capitalism. You're asked to do certain intellectual activities, but you have the capacity to do so much more, but you're never asked to. In fact, you're specifically discouraged from doing that, again, for very specific reasons. The system doesn't want you to realize that you can. So, but Gramsci's point is like everybody is capable of intellectual work because you're already doing some of it. You're already asked to do a certain degree of intellectual work. Think of how much you could do if we actually got to the point where the working class were the organizers of production. Think of how much potential is in there. Again, have you ever had those awful things where the boss sits you down and says or asks you, how could you improve your job? Think of ways that we could do this better. In other words, can you think of ways that we can fuck you over? But again, how much human ingenuity would be unleashed by the knowledge that even if you thought of ways to improve your workplace, that you would not lose, you would not be doing yourself out of work, because there would always be work to do, even if you needed to be redeployed and retrained, and that could be done. That could be done by tapping into the huge potential productivity, productiveness of labor within a reorganized workers state. That is something which, of course, the capitalists don't want you to realize. So Gramsci goes on to talk about where the intellectuals come from in this, and I think this is a fascinating historical aside, and one I think that we can dwell on for a little while. He talks about how under feudalism, right, the intellectuals really, some of them were aristocrats in terms of the people who ran the state, the people who were the senior personnel in the state, were dukes, lords, earls, etc., kings. But a lot of the intellectual life in the states of it that made up Italy prior to its unification in the 1860s, a lot of the intellectual life in feudal Italy and also France, Germany, etc. This intellectual life was conducted in the great part by the Roman Catholic Church, and the church was and remains so to a certain degree a way of that was the principal manner by which the feudal lords carried out their own legitimization process. There were certain elements of democracy in there in the system as well, but in terms of the relationship with the masses, the idea of the divine right of kings, the idea of the hierarchy was justified in the feudal period by being literally described in the Bible. Good job you can't read Latin, most of you, but the priest being God's representative, and then him, paying homage or taking his orders from a bishop, an archbishop, a canon, a cardinal, etc., a pope, and the pope being God's bishop of Rome, the crowns of Europe being linked organically to the church, the senior cleric in each kingdom crowning the monarch, etc. Literally, God's representative placing the crown on the head, and that being a crucial part of how feudal society was justified to the masses. But the church also represented a means of social advancement for the subordinated classes, or at least for some in the subordinated classes. So if you were from a lower class and you were from, say, even a peasant, could have a child who was recruited into the church, and you could rise from being a peasant to being like one of the highest members of the church. So, for instance, there was always a sneer by the aristocracy in England at Cardinal Wolsey, one of Henry VIII's original ministers, prior to the split with Rome, because he was the son of a butcher, son of a tradesman, and he'd risen to become one of the highest and admittedly very corrupt and very brutal servants of the church, and was the leading minister of the king. But he had come up via the route of the church to be this very high-ranking minister, a very high-ranking member of the church. So the church actually was a way for the sons of tradesmen, the sons even of small peasants, to actually advance up the ladder. So if we look at this now, in terms of capitalism, a similar thing occurs, which is whereas the lower petty bourgeois, like the labor aristocracy, talking just of the imperialist countries here, and even the lower working class, can't become capitalists, but you can find other ways to join the, let's just call it, the political and cultural elite. You can find a way up by being a politician. Now, admittedly, that isn't something which is available for the poorer end of the masses, but it is a way up for the labor aristocracy, for the petty bourgeoisie. They can advance through the political system, and also you can advance if you're from the working class through the bureaucracy. You can, if you're particularly ambitious and have a degree of intelligence behind you, you can go through the state bureaucracy to reach the highest levels of it, where you're paid a very high six figures sometimes for being an administrator in the state machine. And that's something which can elevate your social class. So this is, again, like this is partly about finding people who can do intellectual work for the ruling class, and also it acts as a legitimating system, because certain layers in the working class will know that their son or their daughter can rise to become a senior official if they get the right education, if they shake the right hand, scratch the right backs. I won't continue with the analogies there, but you know what, you can see what I mean. It's a way in which you can access the higher levels of the system without joining the capitalist class. And the bureaucracy of the church in the feudal period gave access to the higher levels of society to certain people who managed to come up all the way from the lowest classes. Same is true of the political parties and the state bureaucracy here, which is part of why there is a degree of resentment between like the capitalists, the landowners, and the senior representatives in the state bureaucracy. Sometimes it's because there are people there who came from the lower classes, and there is, of course, a degree of tension and resentment there. But that serves as a legitimating force within society, because there are layers even in the working class who see a way forward for their offspring to become important and well-paid, well-remunerated members of the elite that governs the system. So Gramsci goes on to say, the intellectuals are the dominant group's deputies, exercising the subaltern functions of social hegemony and political government. Now, that's exactly what we're talking about here, which is that the intellectuals also include the politicians. They include the figures that produce culture. They include the figures that produce actual typical intellectual work. They are those who organize production, and all of that group are the intellectuals. So you've got those who are directly related to production, those who are related to how to organize workplaces, those who are engaged in cultural work, political work, administrative work, all of that, all of these different categories. It's all intellectual work, which is designed to organize society for the capitalists, organize the state for the capitalists, and organize the production and reproduction of bourgeois ideology to be absorbed into the minds of the masses. All of that is absolutely vital intellectual work. Without it, capitalists would be fucked. Without all these different intellectual functions, they'd sink. They wouldn't be able to sustain their rule. They need these people, and they need the functions to be done competently. Not looking too good at the moment, it must be said, because again, if the intellectual functions seem to be stuffed by morons who don't know what they're doing, who routinely get things wrong. It's because there's a rot in the material base. As we've covered before, you can't escape the material base. As again, we go back to Stalin's famous quote from Anarchism or Socialism, which is that the ideology always runs slightly behind the material base. So the material base in late stage imperialist countries like Britain and the United States, France, Germany, etc., the material base is corroding and decaying due to financialization, but the intellectual functions retain a degree of dominance and sort of impressiveness. They're lagging slightly behind the decay, but they're catching up with the decay now. So it appears that the intellectual functions are becoming completely incompetent and demented because the rot in the material base has made its way up shall we say, up through the roots, up to the stem, and now the leaves are all falling out, and all the petals are falling out of the flower, shall we say. So it is the administrators can't escape the material base. There are theories out there that have been put forward by various opportunists in recent years that everything is now just run by administrators according to their material incentives, their material wants, and that we're in an administrative state. Now, there's certain elements of truth in that, which is that the administrators are important figures. Which is why the capitalists strive to integrate them into ruling class networks, because you want to have a good amount of control over them. But ultimately, these people work for the capitalists, even if there's often clashes between them. There's sometimes when there's a crisis in society, the capitalists will want one thing, and the administrators, because they're employed to take a more comprehensive view, will want something else, and there's often fights between them. These play out in the bourgeois press. These play out in like different intellectual trends, shall we say, different pieces of ideology which are produced. But ultimately, they have to find a way of coming to some sort of accommodation between the administrators and the capitalists to run the state and society efficiently, or relatively efficiently, in order to produce the right amount of conditions that can, or the right conditions that can generate the maximum amount of profit. So, and the Gramsci also observes that in the modern period, the state, because as Lenin correctly stated, that in the period of as capitalism develops into imperialism, the state becomes ever more complicated in terms of the functions it needs to carry out. The intellectual layers therefore expand as the state becomes more complicated, and the state starts to absorb a greater and greater amount of the surplus value created by the capitalists, and in fact the capitalist class goes into debt to keep the state afloat, or the state goes into debt to keep itself afloat. And again, that produces more and more tensions. So this is why the capitalists who are libertarians are so dull-witted, because like some of these people, and I've met some libertarian types who actually think like this, think if we just got rid of the state, we could go back to capitalism in its purest form. But of course, that's a bunch of reactionary utopian nonsense. I mean, some people actually believe this. It's more big in America than it is here. But because the very fact that we got to this state machine that is this complicated, that has this many different specialisms within it, that has this much bureaucracy within it, that's all necessitated by the complexities of having to manage these now decaying late stage imperialist societies. So you just got rid of it, you'd end up with a massive crisis within about a week, which is why they can't and won't. And the libertarians will be forever engaged in a titanic effort of intellectual masturbation with no conclusion. The final points here that I want to make is like this is this is how Gramsci talks about the intellectuals in terms of in terms of capitalist rule, in terms of feudal rule. So, but what about intellectual life under socialism? What could that mean? What can we draw from Gramsci about this? First of all, we have to draw from Gramsci the fact that there's no such thing as a non-intellectual. There's no such thing as somebody, unless they've got something wrong with them, who isn't doing some kind of intellectual work. So that's the first point. So that opens up the way for us to look at how the production and state management or management of society would be conducted under workers' rule, which is that where the defenders of capitalism will argue that, well, you have to have a hierarchy and most working class people couldn't handle this, that, or the other. Again, workers are already handling all kinds of different intellectual work themselves. So to argue that they couldn't possibly handle it is incorrect. The human capacity for understanding is huge and is untapped. So they're already doing a lot of intellectual work. Secondly, we need to collapse the false division between the sort of the what's regarded as purely intellectual work and what's regarded as just stuff that needs to be done. It's all intellectual work, and I hope I've demonstrated that to you in this lecture this evening. It's all this state and society and workplace organization. This is all intellectual work that needs to be done, and it can be done in a different and better way and more efficient way. Because when the working class becomes the ruling class, think of how much gets wasted on making sure how many resources, how much time gets wasted by the capitalists on making sure that workers never unify, on how much energy and money goes into making sure that the divisions between workers are made worse. It's all a great amount. It's all a resource suck out of society. Think of how much more efficient everything would be if what we were dedicated towards was the unity of the working class and the maximum development of the capabilities of the working class. That would unleash a lot of creativity that is suppressed at the moment. Now, the other point is that we need to consider, in terms of how we would develop intellectual life, we need to consider how we learn from what the capitalists have done. The capitalists, and this is where Gramsci uses the term permanent persuader. The capitalists have created, whether they acknowledge this or not, shall we say, intellectual cadres whose job it is to justify the current order of things, and that's something we need to learn from. So I'll just read this quote from from Gramsci, where he talks about this. The quote reads as follows: "The mode of being of the new intellectual can no longer consist in eloquence, which is an exterior and momentary mover of feelings and passions, but in active participation in practical life, as constructor, organizer, permanent persuader, and not just as simple orator, but superior at the same time to the abstract mathematical spirit. From technique as work, one proceeds to technique as science, and to the humanistic conception of history, without which one remains specialized and does not become directive, specialized and political." So what he's talking about here is really what he's driving at is how communists should be. So the communist, in his or her workplace, neighborhood, etc., should play the role of the permanent persuader, not just an orator, but somebody who is embedded within working class life, who plays their part in production or in their other forms of work, who is an active member of their particular community, who by their example, by their hard work and diligence, becomes respected as a leader and engaged and becomes the permanent persuader in their particular community, by, again, not just by intellectual work or oratory, but by commanding respect and by disseminating proletarian ideology amongst the wider working class. And again, persuading people by not just argument, but example as well. And this is, and also by encouraging others to not be specialized as much, but by making more of us into so-called jacks of all trades or jacks of many trades. So the narrow focusing of skills, which capitalism prioritizes, is replaced by a broader approach, which seeks to make anybody capable of being, so we say, an administrator. And this is one of the problems that we need to learn from in terms of the Soviet Union, which is that from the earliest stages, there remained divisions between workers and organizers, administrators, and people who are specialists in organizing and administering production. there needs to be, and this started to be done in the Stalin period, and there were still elements of it all the way up to the early Gorbachev period. You need to have workers being trained in and becoming proficient in administration, management, organization of work life. These are all things which, again, are tremendously important for the capitalists in terms of creating and recreating a profitable workplace, but also creating and recreating bourgeois ideology. So we need to bring forward the skills of the worker to be able to understand how his or her workplace operates, understand the role of the worker within it, but also build a skill set that enables them to play a role as administrators and as organizers of production, not just those who carry out the orders. See, by having as many people as possible be trained as administrators, so you collapse, or we can hope to collapse the barrier between white collar and blue collar work. And there's always going to be some people who prefer one over the other. I mean, no illusions about that. But by expanding the amount of people who understand the administration side of things, who understand the technical things like the accounting, who understand things like how to order raw materials, how to build and just maintain a supply chain, how to do all of those things, you're constantly bringing new people into the mix, into the administration and the organization of things. Or you're just having the group of workers at least have knowledge of those elements of how to organize a workplace, and can, when it comes to having worker democracy, can pose questions to the management and the administrators and hold them accountable. Because if you have a degree of knowledge about how these systems work, you're not blinded by, to use an old phrase, blinded by apparent science. So it's building up the skills of the working class and the confidence of the working class to actually be able to tackle the difficult questions of workplace organization and administration, which I would argue the technological revolution of the last 30 years makes that more possible for us to do, not less. So I will pause there. I think that the essay, The Intellectuals, is relatively short. You can read it in about half an hour. But there's an awful lot in there in terms of how we have to consider what intellectual life is and how it should be organized. And it's a vital piece of reading for any communist who takes seriously the question of, well, how would the dictatorship of the proletariat actually work and look in practice? So, okay. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in thus far. President Jesus says, so let me get this straight, AOC is not an intellectual. Well, in actual fact, that is not true. I mean, AOC is an intellectual, not in the sense of producing dazzling ideas, but in terms of being a creator and a recreator of bourgeois ideology, she is doing intellectual work. It's just not intellectual work that benefits you. It's work that benefits the ruling class ultimately. But yes, all of these people are doing intellectual work. It's just not something they're just not working for us, David King says the New York mayor is a fraud and a crumb through by the ruling class. I would barely classify it as a crumb. A crumb implies that you would notice it if you swallowed it. You wouldn't notice this. So let's say we're going to be looking at Mr. Zoran the con man in the next few days. So probably early next week. We're going to look at him. So hello to Jerry, James Graham, Kaisal Amar. Finish like Jonas Levinson, Sun Chitu, Zamar in Phoenix, Arizona, Robert in was it Long Island you're in? Hello to Lisa P. Hello to Michael McGoldrick. Hello to Huda Kaira. Hello hello to Robert. Hello to Davey. And also, who else we got here? David King, MC Smammer, XNF, who is an anti-communist on Twitch. What a surprise. You are welcome. Huda says, Jane Austen is all about the industrialist landowners and aristocratic paupers, marriages, class analysis. Indeed. Something I've only read one Jane Austen novel. I should probably read more. Hello to Jenny, our moderator, and hello to Alex B. Hello to Sophia, who says, I'm looking very GQ today. Well, thank you very much. This outfit took literally seconds to put together. Even Kaya Kallas is an intellectual. Well, yes, that's true. No, I mean, these people are despicable, moronic, true, but they're performing an intellectual function. Kaya Kallas is performing an ideological function for principally the German, French, British, American imperialists. So, yeah, she is performing an intellectual and ideological function. Doesn't mean it's just not one that's in our interests. So to us, it looks ludicrous. But what is, Kaya Kallas's actual job? Is it to persuade us? No, we're too far gone for her. It's to essentially act as an enforcer of a certain kind of ideology within the political system, and to make sure that that ideology remains unquestioned and unchallenged. That's why you have a belligerent moron in that role, because that's what it requires. It requires somebody to go out and repeat the lines with a degree of undeserved confidence over and over again, and she does that very well. Same with Ursula von der Leyen. It's these are ideologues, hatchet women. These are the persuaders, shall we say, not the Tony Curtis show. But yes, it is intellectual work. Trump thoughts on Trump's threats to the global south, like Nigeria. I'd say if I were I Nigerian, I'd be more worried than if I were Venezuelan. This is because Venezuela is, I've argued before, and I will argue still, Venezuela, due to the fact that it is, they are practicing, or they're on the road to a form of socialism. They're trying to build socialism there. It's not the way I would do it, but I'm not Venezuelan. I don't get a vote. And they have spent many years politicizing and mobilizing the masses, now arming the masses. And they have purged the military, so far as we know, of the disloyal elements. It's very difficult for the US to pull off what they need to pull off there. Even if they killed Maduro, they would be faced with an angry, mobilized, and armed working class, which they wouldn't be able to control. It would take hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men to invade and occupy Venezuela. It's a big place as well. It's far bigger than old perfidious Albion. So the aim of the operation in the Caribbean was to intimidate the Maduro and the Venezuelan leadership into quitting, or to provoke a split, or to provoke a coup. The longer it goes on and that doesn't happen, the more that the US will look for easier targets. Arguably, Nigeria is an easier target. It's ruled by a corrupt US puppet regime anyway. If you want to go in there somewhere and steal a lot of resources, Nigeria would be the place to look to. I'd say that they should be careful what they wish for, because there's every chance that the Nigerian masses would resist, and it would be the end of the Bola Tinubu regime and the very corrupt Nigerian state, which is still essentially kept in a neo-colonial stranglehold by the British and the United States. But if you're Trump, you're looking for something. You're Trump and you're a fool, and you're looking for something which represents a good victory. Knocking over, bombing some Boko Haram people who work for you anyway, and claiming victory would be an easier an easier nut to crack, shall we say, than trying to invade or occupy Venezuela. So I'd be more worried about some kind of action in Central Africa than I would be something in Venezuela. Kublai Khan says you should do one on Guy Debord. Only after I've finished Gramsci, you know. Every cook can govern. CLR James. Well, on that question, he was right. Hello to James Goblin. Hello to Chris Rogers over there in Hong Kong. Hello to Alexander Lukta. Hello to, who else we got? Markeen, who liked the description of libertarians. Who else we got here? Street Cat Munchies says, my boss asked me to create an Excel spreadsheet and that radicalized me. Of course it would. I've spent 8 hours a day on Excel spreadsheets before, and that would basically turn you into either a raving communist or a lunatic, one of the two. What about intellectuals within the arts, asks Matt Parker. Well, I mean, artistic expression is, or should we say cultural production, let's call it that. Cultural production is an absolutely crucial piece of bourgeois ideological production and reproduction. Particularly like if you, again, you have to consider things as an all-encompassing whole. So bourgeois ideology is something which is created and recreated everywhere. And in the arts, in culture, that's more blatant. It's because they're trying, often these days, trying to get a very specific political message across. This goes for god awful BBC dramas, about trans rights, something stupid. But also, again, remember what I was saying about the way in which every single part of bourgeois intellectual work is dedicated towards making it seem as if the current social order is natural. Even those bits of it which appear to be critical are also part of this. So I would say those of the people who work in the cultural sphere, whether they know it or not, are playing their role in the intellectual justifications, ideological justifications for the current order. Now I will bring this into future film reviews, of course, but like if you just look at how most cultural production is done, if you look at how films are produced, let's use the example of the United States. These are produced by studios controlled by monopolies, controlled by ultimately by banks, either like they're owned by like something like Amazon, which again is like ultimately linked then to the banking system. Ultimately, it all links back to a tiny number of characters who, or should we say, capitalists who own can actually exercise effective control over production. Used to be in the old days that there was a greater diversity of people who owned and controlled studios. Now there isn't. Now it's just like a tiny number of monopolies that control everything. And monopolies, of course, late stage imperialist entities want certain specific things. Some might say, oh, they just want to make money. Well, sometimes some things, yes, and other things, no. They don't underestimate the willingness of the capitalists to institute cultural productions or create culture that isn't going to make money, but it is going to serve as an ideological justification. Perhaps we could have some case studies of this, something which just serves an ideological function, not just a profit function. But even with films that are ultra commercial and appear to have no political message behind them whatsoever, such as the Fast and the Furious series. Now I've only seen 3 of these. The last one I saw was 20 years ago, maybe. But there is an ideological element even to the Fast and the Furious, which is that it is the way that series developed, and perhaps I should watch all 10 or 11 or 12 or whatever the fuck it is. The way that what that series is based on is based upon the idea of like transcending the transcending the restrictions of everyday life via two things: criminality and friendships based on criminality. See, capitalism constantly promotes criminality because, in actual fact, criminality is a safe outlet for frustration and rage. People who are angry, people who want to improve their situation, people who want to escape from the day-to-day mundanities of capitalism. Well, if you push them into criminality, that's actually a safe way for them to go. So that's part of the reason why the late-stage imperialism promotes things which glorify mafia figures, things which glorify violence, things that glorify drug dealing, things that glorify pornography, things that glorify all kinds of degeneracy. It's safer to have people push towards thinking that this is somehow cool and somehow that they want to embrace it and as a way out of the alienation that they feel. It's much safer for capitalism to push them in that direction, for bourgeois ideology to push them in that direction, than it is to have them actually get genuinely radicalized. So the promotion of criminality and degeneracy is absolutely crucial for late-stage imperialism. Better to have them be gangsters than be revolutionaries. Okay. Dingo Ate Me Baby says, I'm a Nigerian prince, and if you just send me 10 grand, I can start to mobilize a communist revolution. Wow, that seems like a convincing argument. Okay. Hello to Bob in occupied Australia. Going to draw things to a close for this evening. Again, what we'll be doing is one of these per week. Going to make it a Saturday thing most of the time. So if you want to follow along with this, next week we're going to be doing the follow-up essay, which is called On Education. So that's another short one. Again, you can find this. These are downloadable fairly easily. I will put up a link on the Telegram and on the Twitter to this. So next week, this same time again, we're going to be doing the second essay, which is Education, on Education, subtitled The Organization of Education and of Culture. So if you join me 7 p.m. next Saturday here, we're going to be going through that and talking about this in a similar way to what we've done this week. So I'll schedule that as soon as possible. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon. We're going to be having another patron stream at 7 p.m. on Monday, where I'm going to be talking about the behind-the-scenes story of the debate last week that I had with Chris Cutrone on the Morbid Symptoms channel. So going to be talking about that on the Patreon stream on Monday. Tomorrow, we will have probably around about 7 p.m. The second part of our celebration of the October Revolution of 1917. So tune in for that. I'll be back with you then. I bid you good evening and leave you with your video outro.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.